Well, when you get to the details in your landscape, what brush are you going to reach for? Well, we're going to look at a whole bunch of them today. We'll talk about the pluses and the minuses, the whats and the wherefores, and hopefully help you make an informed decision when you reach for a detail brush. Well, hello minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. We're going to talk about brushes, but with a specific focus in mind today. Details, painting those little tiny details. Little frilly edges, thin lines, fur, you name it. Anything that you can think of that's a tiny detail, that's what we're focused on, but we're focused on the brushes. So when you are looking for brushes and you want to paint those details, what do you reach for? What are the best brushes to reach for? Well, as in all of watercolor, there isn't a best necessarily for any one situation. And we are not going to get into best brands today because there are so many really good brands out there. I will be mentioning some brands. What we're going to be talking about is types. And I hope to be able to educate you a little bit about the different characteristics and what to look for in a brush that's going to help you when you need to paint those details. And it doesn't matter whether you're a loose painter, an expressive painter, an abstract painter, a hyperrealist. Everybody usually eventually wants to paint some small details. Okay, with that said, we're going to start with the most common, and that is the round. When people ask me what brush to start with, I always recommend a round. If it's the only brush you ever were able to paint with, I would get a round. But now all rounds are not created equal. So when we're talking about details, we're talking about points. And a lot of rounds do not have great points. And that may be by design. A round doesn't always have to have a razor tip point. So you may get rounds like this. These are rounds that have what I would call average points, not super sharp detailed points. And the bigger you get, the more that tends to be the case. Now, size doesn't always indicate whether you're going to get a good point or not, especially with rounds. This number 10 silver brush, black velvet, has about the same point as this. So if you're wanting details, you might say, well, why not just paint with those? Well, because you may want to be able to hold more paint. So there are more considerations than just point. But for the purposes of this video, let's assume that we're trying to choose a brush that will give us a great point for detail. Now, you may want to choose a brush where you're painting details, but you want it more all-purpose, to go effortlessly from bigger washes down to details and back without changing brushes. So rounds are a great choice for that. Here's two brushes that have excellent points, and I'm just going to demonstrate with some random paint that I have on the palette. This is a number 8 Scotta Reserva Kolinsky Sable, and you can see it will get some pretty broad washes, but it's got a really nice point. So one comment I have that's going to apply to all the brushes we look at today is that points are going to vary even among a particular set type of brush that might be considered a detail brush. For instance, you may have a rigger or a liner, which are known for sharp points, and I have gotten them, believe me, where the point wasn't all that great. So if you're physically shopping for a brush and you're actually there and able to pick it up and hold it and look at it, you want to look at the tips, because a lot of times they will differ even among the identical brush. That's just sort of a general comment. We're looking at what I would consider the best all-purpose choice. And this is a good illustration right here of how size does not always translate to the tip. This has an extremely fine tip. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite. Got a very fine tip, but a very broad belly. So when you're choosing a round for a brush and you want a brush that's able to paint details, you need to decide whether that brush needs to be multi-purpose, be able to do multi-functions, or whether you can get a brush that's just going to paint particular details. One of the things I would say about a brush like this, is that the tip, while it's very fine, to paint consistently a particular detail, you're going to have to contend with all the water in there, and you're going to have to want that. That's going to have to be a characteristic that you want. A brush like this, though, is good at a variety of strokes, being able to vary your stroke. We'll look at some brushes in a minute that are even better at that than this. This number 12, big brush, I don't think if I were painting a lot of details, I would pick this, but it's great to have when I'm making those broad washes, and then I need to just get down and filigree out an edge. Versatility, that's the round. And if details are not something that you're caring about too much, really tiny details, then the rounds with the more average point may be just fine. But I love this Escoto Reserva, which, again, this is a Kolinsky Sable, but it still is a good example of many of the types of brushes you can get. A number 8 is a really good all-purpose brush, and I could paint a lot with this. I could be painting along and basically come up with any size wash, from the broadest side swiping wash to the tiniest little details. Can't beat the versatility of a round. That said, if I know I'm going to paint details, endless details, a lot of details, I don't need necessarily all that water holding ability of the big belly. So this has been one of my favorite brushes for years. This is a number 4 silver brush black velvet round. This brush here is about 15 years old, I think, and it basically performs now the way it did when I was brand new. It's just fantastic. And I have just painted for hours with this, because it will go again from the broadest, at least as broad as a number 4 will make, to little details. And it's a great water holder, part squirrel, part synthetic, but it gives me those nice medium, small to tiny strokes. All right, so the standard round. So let's move into, I would call it an overlapping category, but a slightly different category. And there are a number of names for these. And let me just say that naming conventions don't automatically tell you what you're getting, because with brands, they're all over the place sometimes. But in general, we're going to talk about naming conventions. These are called pointed rounds, or in some cases, designer rounds. I would put those in the same category. Now, you're going to say, well, some of those look just like the other. Yeah, and you would be right. Usually, a designer round or a pointed round is longer. It has a longer point, and it has a skinnier belly. Yes, you will find standard round brushes that look almost the same. But in general, a standard round is shorter with a stubbier point. This Winsor Newton Series 7 Kolinsky Sable, just one of the most amazing brushes that I have. And that long, skinny tip is just amazing. So I can do a lot with this brush. And it will paint just a whisper of a line. So again, as in all other rounds that have good points, very, very versatile. Some other varieties, this is the Protégé Plus. This is a synthetic. This is their pointed round. Now, their pointed round to me looks very much like a standard round, but I think the difference is usually from where the belly ends to the point is usually longer. A standard round may be able to come to a sharp point, but usually the gradation from the belly to the point is a little shorter. So if I had to pin it down, but again, you're going to get differences with different makers. But here, this is a synthetic version of the same sort of thing. You can get whisper fine lines and then paint nicely with the belly. Has great water holding characteristics. So the Turkel Protégé Plus, good example. A brush that I have really enjoyed lately, it fits into that pointed round category, is the Silver Brush Golden Naturals. And these are called ultra rounds. Very thin rounds for the size. For instance, this one here is a number 10. And that is quite a bit smaller than what you normally find for a number 10. But you can see it's a flatter belly and a longer gradation to the tip and razor fine points. So this is a good step down in size from a standard round that has a good point to maybe a brush where you want to be able to paint in some areas and go to fine details. Still versatile, but on the smaller end. I love the performance of these Golden Naturals. This is a blend again. This is a synthetic and natural blend. I don't know what the natural is. It's probably something like goat. Lovely, lovely brush. And if you want it in a smaller round, there you have. What this is almost a rigger, except riggers are longer. And we'll be talking about riggers in a few minutes. But this smaller one, it's got about the same point. And that's what's interesting, is that size does not always translate, as I mentioned before, to thin points. So usually what you're varying and what you're changing is the amount of water that it holds. And that may be important. You might want to paint drier. Obviously, I can't paint as big an area. But when I'm painting smaller details, whisper thin lines, I might have a little more control because it's not going to slip into that broad stroke. I hope that's all making sense. All right, so pointed rounds or designer rounds. It's another great, very versatile, but highly detailed category. All right, we're going to look at what I would call also pointed rounds, but exotic. These are exotic pointed rounds. Let's talk first about handmade. And there may be other makers out there, but Levinson is probably one of the only games in town. These have a lot of the same characteristics of the pointed rounds that I just showed you. So I won't spend a lot of time here. This goat and synthetic blend from Levinson is one of my favorites. It's a very long point, but a fat belly towards the end, so it will hold a lot of water and you can paint fairly controlled details for a long time. That longer point also facilitates a little more expression, and that's something we'll talk about as we get into riggers. Longer points allow you more spring. So when you're talking about a round with a decent point, but a fatter belly and a shorter point, you have a little less control over the width of the line. So if you have a problem with shaky hands, which I do sometimes, you won't find it as consistent. That's what a long point will get you when you need to paint long, consistent, detailed lines. So a unique brush. A couple other brushes in the Levinson line, just for ultra details, and brushes I would classify as detailed rounds. Very much the same as a pointed round or designer round is the Silver Fox. It's one of his priciest brushes, but it's very nice. Paint a lot of details. A footnote I always add to something like Levinson is you don't need to pay this kind of money for a brush. This is a luxury brush. These are for those who just appreciate lovely handmade quality. He makes them all himself by hand. And if that's something that appeals to you, it won't help you paint any better, but it sure is fun to paint with. So yeah, that's a Silver Fox. This is called his Itty Bitty Elk brush. And this is probably the smallest brush I've shown so far. But that is, for all intents and purposes, a pointed round. Not a great water holder, but then if you're just going to paint a lot of details, you don't need a lot of water. It still holds enough, it's going to get you where you need to go. These are two I found. I haven't really been able to test them thoroughly yet. But these are calligraphy brushes from the Manuscript company. If there's an Amazon link, I'll put it. There probably is. I got these actually at a local shop. These are intended for calligraphy. That's what the Manuscript company makes, but you can use them for whatever. So not as long a point. These are infinitely less expensive than, say, a Levinson. I got a set of 3 of these for about $10. And this is a combination of goat and sable. Beautiful thin lines. So it's a good value. So again, if I can find an Amazon link below, I'll put it below. One thing I noticed about this when I first got these wet is some of this handle stain came off on my hands. It stopped, but make note of that. Those are the more exotic, what I would refer to as pointed rounds. All right, let's just get into smaller brushes in general. You may have seen tiny little brushes like this. These can go from size 0 all the way down to, I've seen 20-0 or 20-0. Now, generally, these longer ones here, like this, are still considered rounds. This one here is called a spotter. The spotters are not overly used or typically used in watercolor much, primarily because they don't hold a whole lot of water and paint. They're designed for more viscous paints. So used for a lot for nail brush art, painting miniatures, decorative painting. that sort of thing. Doesn't mean you can't use it though for watercolor. But I would classify spotters, and there's very little difference between spotters and really tiny rounds, except tiny rounds are usually a little longer. Spotters are usually very stubby. But I would classify spotters and small rounds as a one-task brush. They do one job, and that's paint fine details. But why you might want to use one is usually you can paint fine detail without worrying about a slip and then you get a big stroke like this. So if that's an issue for you, I rarely ever use these type brushes, these fine detail. But they will paint a fine line. And another plus is these are usually a really excellent value. As a matter of fact, I got a whole set of these. It was like $15. And they're pretty good brushes. If you're going to paint a lot of fine lines and you don't want a multi-purpose brush, why not? But I do think if you go this route, pick up a few of these, you're better off to get the small rounds like these two here than a spotter, which again is short and stubby. I mean, if you're going to put, like a gouache dot in the middle of an eyeball, or you're going to put little gouache reflections, this is good at handling viscous paint, and of course just putting little dabs. And maybe the brush you're using, you don't want to rinse out all the color. You just want to pick up a different brush to outline something or put a line or little short strokes on something with a different color. Again, my point here is to instruct you, inform you about characteristics, and let you make the decision based on what you're doing. No situation is right or wrong. It's just a situation. It's just a characteristic that you need to take into account what you need. Speaking of this set, again, which was a very good value, this was part of that set, and this is a good segue into the next category, and that is riggers. And from here on out, everything we're going to talk about is what I would refer to as a specialty brush. It has a special purpose, although you could say those miniature brushes did too. A rigger, which is also called a liner, is a longer detail brush. Rigger is designed to be loaded up all the way to the hilt, at least in watercolor. And the reason is that gives you lots of liquid. It doesn't dump it all at once, but it allows you to paint continuous lines seemingly forever. That is one of the rigger's strengths. That's why a lot of them are called liners. They will come in different lengths. If they get too long, I don't like them because they get limp. But the length adds like a shock absorber. So I can press and not really change the width of my line. And it absorbs some shake. If I tried to do that same thing with a standard round, and I'll even get a small round here, I have to hold a lot more control on my hand because if I press a little too much or slip, that happens. Now that may be what you want, but if what you want is this, it's going to be harder with this. You got to control your hand a lot more. So that's where riggers and liners excel. See, I'm not paying a whole lot of attention to the pressure I put on it and the control. It's a lot more relaxed stroke, and I'm getting a consistent line. And I'll use riggers a lot for tree branches. One of my favorite brushes for tree branches. I can get some width to the stroke, but it's a little easier to control. There's a number of them. This came with that cheaper set of the small rounds I was showing you. Here's probably two premium examples that I commonly use. This is probably my favorite. This is a Grumbacher Golden Edge. It's just one of their top of the line golden Taklons. I like riggers that have a lot of snap, and this does. I've done paintings where I've used riggers to draw with, usually with lighter color paint than that, but this is not a detail. Well, maybe it is a detail thing. I love riggers for putting on their side and dry brush going upward. It's not sort of a scumble, if you will. Yeah, that's a Grumbacher Golden Edge. This is a little bit bigger rigger. This is a Da Vinci Cosmo Top Spin. A little bit bigger. I can get a big bit fatter line. Riggers will actually go up to fairly fat brushes. I don't like them, again, because they're limp when they get bigger, like springy, stiff. That's just a personal preference. Main difference, again, is a long point. All right, continuing on in the specialty category, we're going to move to a really odd type, or very specific type, the dagger or the wedge, and these are also called triangle brushes. They'll do similar things. Now you may wonder, why do I have these as a detail brush? Well, because on the dagger, for example, if you get the right one, you will get a tiny little tip. When I say if you get the right one, I have seen daggers. In fact, I have one that doesn't have a tip at all. It's just basically a blade. Now, these are prized among floral painters. This is not something you'll normally see with a landscape painter such as myself. I started experimenting, though, with daggers a while ago. I don't use them very often just because I forget about them. But I really had an enjoyable time painting a landscape with a dagger, and I will link to that video if you want to see it. The main reason I like them is you get an expressiveness that sort of is outside of the normal stroke that your hands would make. In other words, you start using certain brushes like rounds to do expressive strokes, and your hand translates those strokes very predictably sometimes so that they'll make marks that are very recognizable. Not so, or not as much, with something like a dagger. I mean, if I just vary the pressure and then come back out on the tip, I just get an expressiveness, a calligraphic-like stroke that's really neat. And that can be great if you're trying to scumble in some underbrush or, you know, make some texture. It's something that's fun to experiment with. Most of the tutorials and videos I've seen on YouTube about these are from floral painters, and there are some very controlled strokes. I don't really know how to do any of them, but they're out there. It's just, they're fun to experiment with. But I mean, just take it and try drawing a tree with it and see what happens. It's kind of neat, actually. Let up on your pressure. Let that point come into play, and that's a far more expressive sort of a tree trunk there than I could have done, you know, with a standard round. It has some real possibilities, and there are different sizes. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite. I have two Princeton Neptunes here. This is going to illustrate well what I'm talking about with point. You can get daggers that have not as much point. That's actually the case with this smaller one. This is a 1/4 inch. It's got a bit of a point. This 3/8 inch actually comes to a much finer point. This gets back to my original point where size doesn't necessarily translate to the tip or the point that you get. The tip just really dances. Don't expect a lot of control, but if you're wanting to, I mean, look at that sort of vegetative group of weedy things there. I don't know what you call them. Really neat little expressive strokes and marks. It's a brush you can definitely experiment with. I mean, look at that. Isn't that cool? You're probably going to have to do your own experimenting. Again, I tried to find tutorials that would help, but most of them were floral painters doing very specific, controlled, you know, flower petal shapes. If you're into that, hey, great. Go watch them. Now, a similar brush that I am not nearly as familiar with, I've been asked if I would try it, but I've just sort of been putting it off, is the wedge or the triangle brush. It is exactly what it says. It's a wedge. When you look at it end on, it's literally a triangle. And it comes to an extremely sharp point. Let's see what it'll do. This is actually my first time doing any experimenting with it. Again, for me, not being a floral painter, I'm looking for some expressive marks that kind of get outside of, you know, the hand memory that your standard strokes will provide you. Almost some automatic styling to your strokes. Mark making that is delightful but expressive, could be translated to something realistic. I mean, I like to sometimes, when I'm trying out these these more expressive brushes, just paint something I would normally paint, like let's say but using one of these weird brushes. Let's see what happens. Sometimes really delightful things will happen. I love how it comes to that sharp point. Neat. And they come in different sizes. This is a medium. This is the silver brush ruby satin. It's a medium and this is extra small. So there is something, if you want to learn to do some expressive strokes, get your mark making out of the norm, these daggers and wedge triangle brushes might be something that you want to try. But I definitely would classify them as a detail brush because of their razor fine points. All right, let's look at one last thing not to be left out of detail, and that is what I call ugly brushes. You'll look at this and say, Steve, that is anything but a detail brush. A lot of times for detail, you're just painting texture, and you want that texture to be randomized. And what is more detailed than something like that? Ugly brushes. Now this is a Sumi, doesn't have a very good point. I like ones that can be splayed out like that. And then it could be old brushes that have worn out. These make good brushes for doing dry brush texture. So just throwing this in at the last, just to say, don't forget about these for painting your details. I mean, this is sort of in the Bob Ross school of thought, where he paints pretty much everything with a big brush, and he lets, the texture of his brush create the details. Well, same idea. Immediately I'm thinking, well, what can I do? Maybe I combine that with one of these wedge or triangle brushes. And now I'm sitting here thinking I've got to do a spontaneous painting with some of this. I'm going to have to. So look for that to come soon. Because I'm sitting here thinking this is just like way too fun. It's just making marks that my hand is going, whoa, did I do that? Neat. We all need the more controlled brush strokes, but especially in landscape, this stuff right here just gets awful fun, and there's definitely a place for it. Anyway, I think this is a good note to end on. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think I wanted to give you information for making choices. Maybe you're not happy with the detail brushes that you own. Maybe you're a beginner looking to expand your collection. You don't know which way to go. So I hope that's been helpful. But I want you veterans out there, your experienced painters, to tell me what your favorite detail brushes are down in the comments. Tell me what they are and why. Don't forget the why. Say, I like to use this brush because fill in the blank. And that way, viewers can not only watch this to gain information, but they can look in the comments and maybe perhaps get some other advice, some that I hadn't thought of. Hope that's a help. Again, I will link to the dagger brush demo I did. You can watch that. And we will see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.